we're going to go ahead and get started here. So I'd like to start off by saying welcome on behalf of UGA Extension, Pike, and Spalding counties. My name is Brooklyn Wassel, and behind the scenes in the chat, you will find Philip Hensley. He is the Extension Agent in Spalding County. So while you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to shoot those in the chat box, and Philip will be answering as we go, and then I'll also be happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation. So if you see Philip Hensley in the chat or behind the scenes, you know who's working there. That is our other extension agent helping to put this on. So like I said, just a big welcome, talking about one of my favorite topics. And hopefully everyone here feels the same, or at least you think you do right now, and that's what we're going to discuss. So just kind of a roadmap of what we're going to talk about and what we're going to cover today. I want to give an introduction both to myself and to the honeybee. We're going to talk about why maybe you're considering bees in the first place, or maybe some things that you haven't thought about yet, some benefits of keeping honeybees, not challenges, but maybe some considerations to make beforehand, some preparations that you'll need before you actually get bees. And then if you're just still committed, the next steps that you need to be taking before you actually have bees. Little background on myself. I grew up in North Georgia, so Gainesville. I was around a lot of livestock growing up, horses, cattle. Gainesville's the poultry capital. So I was around a lot of chicken houses, but never around bees. I went to college for an animal science degree in animal nutrition, again, still working with livestock. That brought me to Pike County to be an extension agent here. But bees didn't come about until UGA has a county-based program for their extension offices. So that means our communities, our very local communities, drive what kinds of programs we offer. And there was a lot of demand for beekeeping programs. Those had been going on in the past, and people wanted those to come back. So I said, okay, that's my job as an extension agent, to offer programming that is wanted by or needed by the community, but I know nothing about bees. So I started bringing in some really, really wonderful experts, some master beekeepers and beekeepers through UGA. And we kind of started down this whole beekeeping journey. Little did I know that when I even started that journey, that bees are considered livestock. So I really was just going from 1,000-pound animal that I was used to working with to insects. So there's a lot of things that are in common with that mindset when you think about managing livestock, but bees just kind of bring a whole new meaning to managing large numbers. I had a program that was started called In the Apiary with a really wonderful team. Philip Hensley was a part of that team. And we traveled the state and went Facebook Live, meeting with beekeepers and learning how they dealt with bees in their apiaries, and just how really they would use what I call the blend of art and science of keeping bees, because there's so much science involved, but then there's that individual, just artistic component of how beekeeping works for you that we really explored through that series. So that was a really wonderful time, and that just catapulted the whole beekeeping program that we had here in Pike and started to kind of spread throughout the state. So that's a little bit about me, but let's meet the real star. This is the honeybee, Apis mellifera. Also, let's kind of break down what actually makes up the bee. So it's funny to think about that. Some don't actually know what a honeybee looks like or how to determine it from a bumblebee, and that's completely okay. Maybe you've never taken the time to look at a flower and see what's going on, like we would with the pollinator census, and start to actually just slow down and look at life in these smaller forms and see. So just a little bit about the bee's anatomy. It has 3 body sections, 6 legs, 4 wings, believe it or not. I know that can be kind of tough to see at times. Has 5 eyes, which is pretty incredible. Think of now why it's such a good flyer. And then that hairy body, which helps so much with pollination. That's extremely important. But there are 3 major bees in the hive. So I want to kind of give you an introduction to them and what they're doing. First, we have the drone, and I start out with him. These are all our male bees. They're drone bees because it's kind of easy to wrap your head around. He has one job. I bet no one can guess what that is. It is to mate with the queen, or hopefully mate with the queen. Because that's his only job, he is kind of a slacker on helping out with any other responsibilities. And because of that, he was never given a stinger. So when people pick up bees and you'll see them holding in their hand, a lot of times, especially if working with kids, beekeepers will pick up drones because they don't have a stinger. So it's a really nice way to have a less scary interaction with a honeybee, because there's nothing really this guy can do to you. So one job, not a bad life, but he is very much a couch potato for the rest of all of his days if he doesn't get to mate with the queen. Speaking of the queen, this is the female that's capable of reproduction in the hive. She's laying up to about 2,000 eggs a day in her peak season. So we're thinking about spring and even summer. She is laying a lot of eggs. Yes, we normally say that she's in charge of laying all the eggs in the hive. Well, I like to preface that with saying most of the time. You can have something called a laying worker. That's maybe indicative of the queen not doing her job so well, or someone's just gone rogue and didn't really think about what their job description was truly supposed to be. But if everything's going according to plan, the queen should be the one laying all the eggs. She's the only one that can lay fertilized eggs. And you can see just the difference between the drone that had those huge eyes and kind of rounded body. Again, I just kind of think of him as the couch potato. And then this queen has the just elongated abdomen, because think of all those eggs that she's laying. Now, the bulk of who we're going to see, the worker bee. These are all females. And I think I kind of caught a glimpse of most of our audience today. So that should make most of us feel pretty good. So these are all female workers. They all start out with certain jobs in the hive, like being a nurse bee, taking care of the other baby bees. And then they progress through different jobs in the hive, and eventually, most of them are going to become foragers, or the ones that actually go out of the hive, and the ones that you see visiting pollen and nectar sources and bringing those back. So this is going to be the most visible part of the hive, both in number and just because that's who you're going to see out and about. So now that you've kind of been introduced to these honeybees, let's think about why we're even considering them in the first place. So let's talk about pollination. Pollinators are insects, animals, can accidentally be us sometimes or on purpose, but it's going to transfer pollen from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower, and then life cycle gets to keep going, or maybe we're making fruit or vegetables. Whatever that particular plant needs, it's keeping the reproductive cycle going. So that's extremely important, because I said fruits and vegetables. Honeybees account for 1/3 of the food that we eat. Or I should say pollinators account for 1/3 of what we eat. Honeybees can make up a bulk of that, depending on where you are and what crop you're talking about. But just some things that we rely on pollinators heavily, we're talking about apples, cucumbers, melons, blueberries, squash. And I apologize if you haven't gotten your lunch yet, because that sounds delicious. Sign me up for all of those. But if you think about a third of all the food that we eat, hopefully that drives home just how important pollination can be. So just in case you weren't hungry enough for that slide to really get to you, let's think about just the bulk of how much it's worth. So it contributes over $19 billion in the US, and over 54 million in Georgia. Just basically the farm gate value, or the value of pollination in agriculture. We're talking about billions of dollars. That's pretty impressive coming from an insect. So I did put in some examples here because I have Philip with Spalding County on with me. We have Spalding County last year. Our honeybees accounted for $42,000 worth in value. In Pike County, a little over $57,000. Whereas one of our largest commercial beekeeping counties down in Clinch, that's in South Georgia, is over $7.73 million in value. And those are not just pollination values, those are specifically honeybee values. So just think about the true value that that's providing. And I put this picture on here just in case you didn't know that we actually transport these gals all over. This is a commercial operation that can be used to take bees from one part of the country for pollination and follow the honey flow to another. So depending on what crop, and almonds is a really great example that takes a lot of pollination, and we'll get bees taken over to California for that. But it can follow everything from bees moving from South Georgia to North Georgia for the sourwood flow, all the way back down for Tupelo honey. And so bees are moved around quite a bit to make sure that you're catching what needs to be pollinated and what type of honey that you're wanting to produce. So this all sounds really great, but what if your concept of bees is just that you want to increase pollinators overall? You think pollination is important, but you're not doing it on some large scale. You know, what are our other options? So if you're considering honeybees because you want to help out the pollinators, I say that's great. But I also would like to point out that we have native pollinators. So honeybees are not native to the US. They have been here for a long, long time, but we actually have native solitary bees that are actually more efficient at doing their jobs than our honeybees. Honeybees, we just kill it with numbers because of the sheer number of bees in a hive, and we can move them around pretty easily. It's a little tougher to tell a bumblebee what to do. But if you're wanting to increase your overall pollinators just for the, the good of your garden, the good of the planet, then you don't have to dive into honeybees. We can do things to help our native pollinators, like making mason bee hotels or native bee hotels to help increase young. We can leave leaf litter there to help them have habitat. We can leave logs in the woods instead of picking everything up nice and neat. We can plant certain things. That's probably enough for most people to really feel good about helping out pollinators. It's also probably enough for your, if you have a smaller garden or you're just wanting to make sure that your squash get pollinated, that's probably enough. Your native pollinators can take care of that for you. However, if you have a couple of acres of blueberries, or you're looking to make sure that you make the best fill in XYZ, then to ensure that you're getting enough pollination for your crops, if you're starting to look at a larger scale, then honeybees might be the pollinators that you need. So just consider the best fit for your pollination needs, because the answer doesn't always have to be, well, I need to dive into honeybees. We could do a lot of work through our native pollinators. So that's just a consideration to make. So I know a lot of people want to help out pollinators, and that's kind of a buzzword right now, pun intended, for helping and feeling like we're really doing good. That's true, but there are two lines of thought on that. So just kind of keep that in mind, and I'm happy to discuss that more if anyone has any questions. So getting back to our honeybees, maybe you're looking for a hobby, and that's fine, because this is a great one to have, and everyone needs a hobby. Well, watching TV should not be a hobby. So what are some of the benefits of beekeeping? It can be very relaxing. There's something about the calm hum of a hive. You're by yourself, or maybe you're working with another beekeeper. It is a very relaxing endeavor. I have beekeepers in the county that come from middle school all the way to, I think the oldest is in his 80s that comes to some of my programs. So beekeeping can be for any age. I'm looking at getting my boys some small beekeeping suits so they can start going out with me, because they just love it. They think it's fascinating. So it's a hobby that can definitely grow with you. Absolutely, you can feel like you're helping the environment. I mean, you're putting pollinators out there. They've not been seen to do any harm. They're not taking away resources or anything from our native pollinators. You're really only increasing the biodiversity in that area. So it can be, a good pat on the back. I'm doing a hobby, having a great time, learning something that can stick with me, and yet I'm also helping out the environment. Very cool. And then I say exercise with a question mark, because this can be really as much or hopefully toned down as you need it to be. Bees and bee boxes and honey can be very heavy. So a lot of times we are thinking, if you have a more traditional approach, that you're going to be lifting some 50 plus pounds around. You're going to be standing on your feet. You're going to be leaned over a hive. You're going to be picking up some heavy equipment. In our Georgia heat and humidity, when you're wearing, if you're wearing a full suit in June, checking on bees, I said that was a really good exercise for me, because I think I sweat a couple pounds off every time I went to check bees. That being said, if you're not looking for it to be an exercise regime, there are ways to cut down on the weight. And I do have someone here locally that physically cannot do some of those things. And so we've looked at different hive body types, some different ways to cut down on weight, to basically allow them to still keep bees. So there are some concessions that you can make, or some adjustments to help with that. So, you can take or leave the exercise. If you're wanting it, then don't worry, we can make it nice and heavy for you. If you really can't handle that kind of exercise, then there's certain things that we can do to get away from the more traditional approach. If you are getting into bees for honey, you are not alone. That is a really tempting reason. We'll talk about maybe why that shouldn't be the only one, but if you're thinking about honey, it can be really wonderful and exciting, and a lot to learn, actually. It just never stops with learning about honey. There are over 300 honey varieties, light to dark. They taste different depending on the actual source. So that's when I was talking about moving them for the different honey flows. It can be a replacement for sugar. So those with diabetes can actually use honey as an alternative that doesn't interfere with blood sugar as much as our normal remedies would. It does have some antibacterial qualities for cuts and burns. It's been used forever for a natural cough suppressant. Let's be honest, it's just delicious, and it can be a great way to make friends, especially if you're giving some away during the holidays or just, dropping by and surprising neighbors. It's a really, really nice way to have friends. And if any of y'all are looking to meet that last bullet, I'll give you the address for the office here, and you feel free to be friendly and send honey anytime. Maybe something you haven't considered yet is beeswax. So this isn't something that we just put in the hive or artificially put in there. It actually comes from glands on the abdomen of the bee. And I don't know where I thought it came from, but when I learned about this, it just blew my mind, as if bees weren't incredible enough. So bees are actually creating this other product. It could be used to have a value added product. You're not just looking at honey, you're looking at also potentially some beeswax products, things like candles, lip balm, crayons even. I don't know that we have a large market here in Georgia for wax for skis and snowboards, but to know that that's out there as a market is very interesting, especially in the day and age of everything being bought and sold online. So, if you wanted to go into some value added products, the sky's the limit with beeswax. And let's be honest, the more you're going to learn about bees, they are just that cool. So if you're thinking, I want to get into bees because I just think they're fascinating, I'm right there with you. The more I learn about bees, the more I was like, I'm all about this. What do I do? So I want to talk about, I like the good news first and then the bad news. So let's talk about the benefits first. So of course, all the answers to why were we even considering bees in the first place. So why bees? Pollination, awesome benefit. It's a great hobby. Hopefully you can get some honey. Maybe you're looking at some beeswax, and they're really fascinating little critters. Maybe some benefits are also additional income sources. This actually, I would say, now that I have gotten into bees myself, I would say, yes, you might want to consider this. We have a slide coming up where we talk about the costs of bees. It's nice to kind of recoup some of those. So think about providing pollination services. That does mean moving them, having contracts, things of that nature, but it might be worth it. Look at honey sales or some added value product sales. And the number one actually for additional income sources is not pollination, honey, or beeswax products. It is actually the sale of bees themselves. So nukes, or a nucleus colony, that comes with a queen, workers, and then a couple of frames depending on the size nuke that you purchase. So it's kind of a little ready-made hive ready to go that you then expand out to your hive. Packages, you're talking about a 3 or 5 pound package of bees. Think little bee box, cram packed full of workers, and then a little queen on top in her own little cage with some attendant bees. No honeycomb, no frames. It is just packed full of bees, a package of bees. And then the queens themselves. So you can have replacement queens, or maybe something happened to yours, or she's not doing her job very well. So we have beekeepers that actually sell individual queens. So those bee sales make up some really great additional income sources. Not that there aren't their own struggles and learning curves, but that's definitely where the money is in that particular, in that realm. Beekeeping just has a lot of great people involved. So a lot of great groups. I would highly encourage you to at least be involved in your local club, local and state. You can go all the way up to national and international. And I know we had some folks joining from outside of Georgia, but I would encourage you to look up your state association and you find your local club If there isn't a local club, find the nearest one or think about starting your own. The sky's the limit, because once you start in the world of beekeeping, these people are going to, you're going to flock together because everyone wants to talk about them because they're so fascinating. And you get together and share ideas, and local clubs are just a really, really good time full of great people. So one of the benefits is definitely having just these clubs and associations to be a part of. If you don't like learning, bees are not for you. So I say a benefit is that you get to learn for a lifetime, but that's also why I love my job as an extension agent, is because I love learning and I'm always learning something every day. But there is new research coming out. There's always new ideas, especially if you're going to those local clubs and getting new ideas from other beekeepers. You're going to have to find your own blend of art and science. And I mentioned that a little bit before within the apiary, but you're going to put together all these research things that you learn about and all of this just factual science. But then you're going to have to understand that every hive is its own and they don't always read the textbooks. So you're going to have to find what works for you. And I call that the art. So you have to blend those two together to find what works for you. And when you do, it's just kind of magical. So that's really fun. And then there are conferences to go to. Georgia Beekeepers Association has a conference twice a year. And then we also have our Beekeeping Institute, that's once a year. So there's always something to go to and enjoy, whether it's a honey show or educational programs and events, things that Extension puts on. So there's always an opportunity to go and learn and do. So that all hopefully sounds really awesome, but let's talk about some considerations to make before you jump in. And not saying that these are necessarily challenges, just some things to consider. So you could have, depending on where you are, potential restrictions and zoning concerns. Now, according to Georgia's Department of Ag, no one can prohibit you from beekeeping. However, they might have some additional hoops to jump through about where they can be, or some barriers or square footage, that kind of thing. So be sure to look those up ahead of time. That's not something that you want to jump into beekeeping. You've spent the money, you're invested, you have your bees, you're loving every minute of it, and now all of a sudden you can't have your bees, or you have to do something else, or they have to be moved. This is something to consider well in advance and know what's going on. And I like to just throw this out there because most people are going to be happy that you're having bees. And again, kind of sharing honey and being upfront is going to help with that. But know going in, don't get blindsided by this, but also know that you have a right to keep bees. Some other considerations to make are that your neighbors, although you've already told them that you're gonna provide them with some honey every now and again, you tried to sugarcoat it some, maybe they're not so excited about you having bees. Maybe they're afraid, or maybe they just don't understand, or they think they're going to be all over their roses, or you have customers, if you have them at a business or a storefront and your customers aren't such a big fan. That's something to think about. Not that it should stop you from getting bees, but it should be some considerations to make on how to mitigate that and keep those relationships good. So try to be a good neighbor. Discuss your plans first. Let them know that the bees are coming in. And normally this is an opportunity to educate. So not everybody understands that bees aren't out to get them, or maybe they are scared, or they've never even seen a beehive before. So if you can discuss or talk about and educate, the likelihood of that neighborhood relationship, customer relationship staying good is a lot higher. do know that they love chlorine. So most of us have enjoyed swimming pools or hot tubs and know that for whatever reason, insects always seem to come around, whether it be yellow jackets, some paper wasp, or honeybees. They're always buzzing the swimming pool and the hot tubs, and it's so aggravating. Well, guess what? They're attracted to chlorine. So if your neighbor has a swimming pool, guess where your girls are going to be visiting quite a bit? Probably the swimming pool. Not always a really great way to be neighborly. So if that's the case, you can offer them their own water source with a little bit of chlorine in it on your property to try to lure them to the correct water source to kind of keep them away from the pool or the hot tub. But that isn't always the case. It can be kind of hard to change an insect's mind when it wants to do something. So just keep that in mind. The other is that we feed honeybees. So we feed honeybees a sugar water mixture with sugar water. And guess what's also in hummingbird feeders? Sugar water. So if they swarm, if they're thinking that they don't like what you're providing as well as what your neighbor's providing, they're hummingbirds, then they can actually be a nuisance at the hummingbird feeders as well. So just thinking about those things. If you have a neighbor that has a swimming pool and 5 hummingbird feeders, know that if they don't love honeybees, they're probably not going to like you, because they're going to have a lot of little visitors that they weren't intending on having. Bees have certain flight paths coming out of their hives. That's also something to think about. I went to a Chick-fil-A that was about 45 minutes away, and it was great and interesting to see that the Chick-fil-A had their own beehives, but the boxes were right near the drive-through window where you would take your order. So every time I would go through and lower my car window to order, honeybees were there buzzing around everywhere because we were in their flight path. So that's maybe not the best option. A couple months later, I think they had a couple customers say something about it. They moved them so that their flight path was not interfering with the car traffic anymore. So it's kind of interesting. We just happen to be right in line with their flight path. And then there are always allergy concerns, whether that's someone in your house or someone that's a neighbor or close by, that you do want to be mindful of, whether that means you keep an EpiPen or know that they have one, or if it's a very severe allergy concern, you might consider keeping the bees somewhere else. So I mentioned this before, but let's look at some of the costs. And like most everything else in the world right now, these costs are going up. So they're still pretty close, but know that, I mean, when I started looking at prices, this was a year ago, and I started saying, well, this is probably $2 more now. This is probably $1 more. So these are at least going to give you a basic idea. So you're going to have the cost of your initial setup. You have to have an actual hive body, or that just basically box that you think of when you picture a beehive. You're going to have the bees. You're going to have some kind of PPE or personal protective equipment, and you're going to need some basic tools to get you going. Just like any other hobby, you can get expensive and you can add to the toys and gadgets and set up and do, but you have to have some of the basics. And then you have maintenance items like pesticides, some additional frames, sugar, like I was telling about feeding sugar water, and your time. So I kind of broke this down to a minimum and kind of what I kind of said was the maximum. And of course, you could still go well above that if you wanted to go crazy. But let's look at the kind of some of these a little bit. So the hive body, the Langstroth hive is the most common hive. The one I've priced out here is an 8-frame hive. So I would say the 10-frame from what I've seen is the most common. So you're going a little bit smaller to try to cut on cost a little bit. You haven't gone with a nuke, you've gone with a 3-pound package. That's kind of the least that you can absolutely get away with. And that package price has definitely gone up this year, but still, we'll still call it 85. Your PPE, you've decided you're not going to do anything but a veil. You just want to keep them out of your eyes, nose, ears, mouth. But everything else, you're okay with being exposed. Your tools, you absolutely have to have a hive tool and a smoker, but you're going with the no frills option. You're never going to put any chemicals or pesticides in the hive. To some, you'd say, okay, that sounds great. To others, they're like, that's not realistic. You can get by with it. You might be doing some other things, some integrated pest management to get around that, but it's possible. Your frames are included in the 8-frame hive body. You're only going to buy 1 bag of sugar, and then after that, like, the bees are on their own. And then I gave you a nice minimum wage of $12 an hour. So because I think y'all are worth it. So looking at all of that before you have really done anything, you're still over $350 for one hive. So to think that this is an inexpensive hobby or endeavor is definitely not the way to go about it. Understand that you are going to have to put some money in to get started. And then the maximum, we did things like look at a flow hive, started with a nuke instead of a package. You went with a suit and gloves, so that it wasn't just the veil, it's the whole suit. A little bit nicer smoker, it's going to hold more, a little bit nicer hive tool, it's got a little bit more gadget to it. You are going to use some chemicals for maybe varroa mites and small hive beetles. You're going to have some additional frames so that you can add to your hive as you go. You're going to make sure to feed them through the winter, and then your time is priceless. So we just aren't even going to add that in because I just think that highly of y'all. So to know that you are not getting out of here for less than $350, but you can throw as much money at this endeavor as you want, and the sky's the limit. All that said, it is, there we go. It's still not a given. There are things that can happen, and you're going to spend some time. How much time is a really common question. So think about it this way. You have a lot of little lives that you are going to be in charge of. There's 60 to 80,000 bees. And they're also, they ain't from around here. They are mostly European honeybees that we utilize here. So you can't be what beekeepers will refer to as a bee haver. You can't just let them go on their own. You do have to do some management. Again, they are considered livestock. So you don't just let cattle go and hope that everything, happens for the best. You need to be checking on them. You need to be providing them with water. You need to be providing them with a food source. You need to make sure that they're actually being taken care of. And bees are the same way. So when it comes to your time, know that you can't just be a bee haver and set them out there and say, I'll be back when the honey's here. You're going to be checking on them and going through and doing some hive inspections. The time of year is going to determine the amount that you're going to be working your bees. So the spring and summer is definitely a busy time that you're in the hive about every 5 5 to 10, depending on who you talk to, but about every 5 days. So just average that out. Maybe once a week, you're checking on your bees. And at first, it's going to be slow going. It's going to take some time to make sure that you put the hive back together, that you find what you're looking for, that you take the time to understand what you're looking at. So when I started with bees this past year, and I kind of went through this whole presentation for a couple years before I decided, okay, I'm ready. So I took the leap this past year, and it took me about 30 minutes per hive when I first started to really go through and do a thorough hive check. And again, pouring sweat in the Georgia heat. So now that the weather's cool, they're not going like gangbusters right now. They're pretty chill. When we spike up into the 60s, they're out foraging and I can take a peek and see what they're doing. It's not as time consuming right now on the actual hive inspections as it is when they are very busy in their peak seasons. You want to think about security of your bee yard. So that means animals. If you're in North Georgia, you have to start thinking about bears. So you do need bear fencing to keep them out. Winnie the Pooh is a very real consideration to make. And you also want to think about if you're in a neighborhood or if you're in somewhere where you're not thinking about bears, even curious dogs. I've had a beekeeper tell me about wild turkeys that were just standing at the opening of the hive and picking them off. You don't want to put them right underneath purple martin boxes or homes because you're just providing a food source for them. So think about animals and what might be curious or want to get in there and do some damage. That includes people, both people looking to maliciously do something like pick up that $350 worth of livestock and equipment and take it on their merry way. Or it could even mean children that are curious and then you have a legal issue at hand because someone wandered up and got curious and now they have an allergic reaction. So humans are something to think about when it comes to the security of your bee yard. And then lastly, wind and storms, which in our area is a timely thing to talk about. How are we going to secure those and keep them from heavy weather events and make sure that they are secured, whether that means ratchet straps and cinder blocks or weighting them down, whatever that means, you want to ensure that they're actually protected from those as well. So we talked about the benefits. You thought about whether or not this was the pollinator that was right for you. We went through some considerations and you're still convinced this is the way you want to go. You want honeybees. So what do you need to do? What's the next step? Think about, we need to start making some preparations now. So make sure you have the right space for them. They need about 20% shade and 80% sun. This is kind of the happy spot for most master beekeepers that you'll get a recommendation. That shade does help them. However, if you stay in too much shade, then you can start to have issues with small hive beetles. So the sun helps prevent and be kind of an integrated pest management approach to some of those in the hive pests. You want them raised up off the ground. 1 to 2 cinder blocks high is kind of the general recommendation. You want to make sure that they have enough forage available. They can fly a radius of up to 2 miles. So if you drop a pin on a map where you're wanting to put these girls and then draw a 2-mile radius around that, that's a lot of space. However, if you can ensure that they have what they need closer, that's just going to be more efficient for them. And then think about having a water source ready, and especially a nice, maybe chlorinated water source to encourage them to come to yours and not someone else's. Make sure you have your PPE ready to go and your equipment. You're going to want to decide how much coverage you feel comfortable with. So whether that's just a veil, that's kind of the bare minimum. Once you start getting comfortable with bees, a lot of beekeepers actually suggest you go without gloves. I personally am not there yet. And then a jacket, which will stop at your waist, but still have the long sleeves come up to a veil, or you can do the full suit, which goes all the way down to your ankles. And then you're going to want to have your equipment ready. So your box, your frames, your hive tool, your smoker, maybe your feeders, have all of that ready to go. That's not something that you want to have the bees and then be putting this together. Make sure you understand the source of both your equipment and your bees. You want to make sure these are reputable. For us locally, we can, local to Georgia, the Georgia Beekeepers Association does keep a list of reputable suppliers, both of equipment and bees, and you can search that on their website. So that helps narrow some of that down. This is not something that you want to go on Craigslist and find, or if you do, you want to know exactly what you're looking for and hopefully know the person, because this is an area where you can get in trouble. The picture here is the required treatment for American foul brood. It is a nasty, nasty disease. And the only thing to do is to burn all of your equipment and bees and anything that came into contact with them. So if you don't know where your equipment is coming from, you could be moving diseases from one place to the next, or getting something that's going to cause you issues down the road that you have no idea. So it's better to start with someone reputable, and then you don't have to worry about something like this. You do need to know that there are different types of honeybees. So two of the most common that I see in our area and that will be recommended in our area generally are the Italians and Russians. So Italians are definitely what we see the most of. They're considered gentle, they're prolific, meaning that queen is really doing her job, and they have a really high honey production rate. So that all sounds wonderful. The reason why we start to consider Russians is because they have higher natural resistance to mites, both varroa and tracheal mites. So if they have a higher resistance, that means less likely for a need for chemical use in the hive. So that's a real benefit. And I know one of our local master beekeepers actually runs a mix, so be an Italian queen and Russian drones, to try to get some of that hybrid vigor. The Russians have been said to be more aggressive. I don't know that there's really enough research to back that up, but knowing that it's just like picking up, if you're looking at dog breeds, it's the same. You can go onto these different honeybee websites and look at Italian bees and Russian bees and Caucasian bees, and they all have their own kind of general standards and then what others will say about them. So just take all that with a grain of salt, but know that these are two of the really common ones. Think about the time of year you're going to be jumping in and make sure you do it at the right time, both for you and the bees. Most beekeepers will talk about spring or fall, and as we are approaching spring, I'd say, yes, this is a great time to be having this conversation. So in the spring, they are more likely to swarm, which is what you see in this picture. However, you also have the likelihood to catch a swarm. It's a great time because you can purchase a nuke and have your colony really already going and off the ground. It's not too hot. You're not having to possibly feed them as heavy as you would going into the winter when it's really tough to make sure that they're doing okay. it's warm enough to be going into the hive regularly. So spring is really a really good time to have most beekeepers kind of enter in and figure out what's going on. It just gives you an opportunity to learn a lot before going into the tough time for an insect in the winter. Make sure you have your support base in place. If you haven't found a beekeeper to shadow, I know I asked the question who had worked with bees, and most had not. So go get your hands on some bees first and see what you think. Ask questions, see if you can shadow them. Make sure that you have someone that you can call and ask or send pictures when you're working bees, because you don't want to be in the bind of having no idea what you're looking at and be watching hours of YouTube trying to figure out what's going on. I think hands-on learning is always the best kind. This is a hands-on workshop that we offered a couple years ago. And honestly, one of the best things that came out of it was a participant saying, "I'm so glad I did this. I was about to get 2 hives and I realized I'm not ready for this. And bees terrify me. I thought I would be calm and they're so cool, but turns out I do not like being in a bee yard." That's really important and good to know, because when she was uncomfortable, by the end of the day, she was okay enough to hold a frame, but she learned then that she would have been miserable if she had been thrown, into the lion's den with a bunch of bees and that she was all of a sudden in charge of. So work with a local club, your local extension office, your state bee lab. Find a beekeeper to shadow or someone that you know is there to support you. Go ahead and attend a local meeting. Most of them allow you to attend for free. You don't have to pay a membership to just go and try it out. Shop around. Don't, like most things, don't jump into the first one that you find. Ask some questions, get in a bee yard. It's never too late to start your beekeeping journey, and don't be afraid to ask for help, because there's always something to learn about bees and you can never know it all. So know that most beekeepers love talking bees and don't mind answering your questions. So if you can start at a local meeting and see who's there and who might be willing to take you in, and kind of a mentor-mentee role, that's a really great way to get started. With that, I just want to thank everyone again, and I will leave my information up here for just a little bit and then stop sharing my screen. So if anyone has any questions, and I'll be happy to answer those, and hopefully I'm helping, we can help you make an informed decision about whether or not to start keeping bees.